Did you know that you and I are related? Yes, you and I. Well, we're very, 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 very distant relatives. But all of us are related. No, Carl, not you. In this video, we're going to talk about our most distant relatives, these chums. Yes, Carl, my resemblance to prokaryotic goo is uncanny. Also, you suck. While dates and theories differ, there's good evidence to suggest that life first appeared on Earth at least 3.8 billion years ago, and possibly even earlier than 4.2 billion years ago, at the close or right after the Hadean Eon, in which the Earth was pelted with asteroids from space. In fact, it's possible that some of the organic molecules, such as amino acids, needed to help facilitate life on Earth came from these asteroids. Recall that for life to begin, we need certain conditions, including the right conditions for complex chemistry. In episode 5, we noted that the early Earth seemed to have the right Goldilocks conditions for the emergence of life. Here, let's take a moment to note that one of the organic molecules required for life to emerge is protein. Proteins, you'll recall from previous episodes, are long strings of amino acids in a particular order, folded up. Well, more twisted together like mangled coat hangers. In living creatures, there are 20 amino acids that combine to make thousands, if not millions, of different types of proteins. There are many more amino acids that exist, but only 20 of these tend to appear in living organisms. To demystify all of this a bit, let's take a moment to recognize that amino acids are simply molecules. They're just particular combinations of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. All amino acids have some things in common. They all have a centralized carbon atom, a hydrogen atom attached to that centralized carbon atom, a carboxyl group, which is just one carbon, two oxygen, and one hydrogen, an amino group, one nitrogen and two hydrogen, and an R group, sometimes referred to as the side chain. Every amino acid has a unique side chain, which is what makes them different. So, note here that amino acids, which are essential to life, are just molecules, a particular combination of atoms. Some were formed at the dawn of the universe, hydrogen, and some, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, were forged through nuclear fusion in stars, created by gravity and empowered by the weak nuclear force. These atoms, themselves held together by the strong nuclear force and electromagnetism, are able to bond with one another because of the electromagnetic force, which, you'll recall, drives the behavior of valence electrons. Oh yeah, it's all coming together. Maybe. So again, we're seeing how all the chapters of the universe story can be viewed as interconnected. Amino acids can form together, again through chemical bonds driven by electromagnetism, to form a peptide. Just sounds so happy. Peptide. Or something you would take when you're having indigestion. One of those two. Multiple peptides can form together to become a polypeptide, and polypeptides can join together or form into intricate jumbles to form proteins, which can include anywhere from around 50 or less amino acids to around 30,000 or more amino acids sequenced together in a particular order. Now, proteins are essential to life, but it seems clear that proteins didn't just appear ready-made. The odds of that happening would be astronomically low. Even for small proteins, say ones that only have 50 amino acids in them, the odds of a particular one forming all at once are really, really low. It would be like rolling 50 20-sided dice and getting an exact sequence from the first roll to the last. If you're wondering, and I think I have this number correct, the odds of this happening are this number. It's a lot of commas. If you rolled those dice once every second, you would succeed, on average, once in every this many years. Carl! So, how did this happen? Well, leaving aside the possibility of a divine actor, which, hey, who knows? The most likely answer is that amino acids built into larger sustainable peptides over time, and those peptides build into more sustainable and common polypeptides over time. And eventually, we get proteins. We can call this process the evolution of proteins. It's interesting to note that evolution doesn't just apply here to biology, but can apply to organic molecules as well, or chemical evolution. This may have occurred alongside of the development of early RNA. In other words, the building blocks for life evolved prior to life beginning, and life probably emerged because of this prebiotic chemical evolution. According to the most common view, the first forms of life on Earth were prokaryotes, single-celled organisms that don't have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles, small structures within the cells that are bound by their own membranes. The genetic material of a prokaryote just chills inside the cell, but it's not bound by a nucleus. The best guess is that this early life formed near a hydrothermal vent in the ocean. For more on this theory, check out the links in the description for this video. They likely fed on the chemicals available to them in those vents. They were chemotrophs. In other words, they were able to metabolize and achieve homeostasis by drawing on the chemical reactions in their environment. At some point, these earliest living organisms split into two major evolutionary pathways, now identified as bacteria and archaea. That means that somewhere between 3.5 and 4.2 billion years ago, all life had what is now referred to as our last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. The organism, or really group of organisms, to which every single living creature today, from the smallest bacteria to us sophisticated humans, and even unicorns, shut up Carl, I know what I saw, can ultimately trace our lineage. Two things should be said of the earliest prokaryote life forms. First, they weren't very mobile. To get their energy, they probably had to hang around areas with chemical diversity and flows of free energy, such as hydrothermal vents in the ocean. Second, they were anaerobic. They didn't require oxygen, here referring to O2. As noted, they made use of the chemicals available, and oxygen was not prevalent in the atmosphere at that time. In fact, oxygen would have been toxic to them. Two things really changed the game for these chums. First, some developed an internal energy grid. This enabled them to unplug from the energy supply of volcanic vents and explore the ocean. Analogously, we can think of this as life getting battery packs, as opposed to having to remain plugged in to an electrical outlet. You can just move around more. Second, some prokaryotes found new ways to obtain energy. Instead of digesting chemicals, some evolved to digest other prokaryotes. They were the first hunters, vicious predators, eating other living organisms to bank their energy. Like us, these creatures were heterotrophs. That is, they lived by consuming other organisms, rather than chemotrophs. Perhaps around 3.5 billion years ago, some other prokaryotes evolved the ability to photosynthesize, tapping into that low entropy energy provided by the sun we talked about in the previous episode. These critters tended to live near the surface of the water, where light was more readily available, and are responsible for some of the rather striking stromatolite features we can still see today. More about that in the description to the video. But the earliest photosynthesizers probably didn't produce oxygen as a waste product. They produced sulfur and sulfate compounds. Somewhere between 3.5 and 2.7 billion years ago, there came along what some refer to as the bacteria that changed the world. Cyanobacteria. These chums could photosynthesize, but they used sunlight to split water molecules and produced oxygen as a waste product. This was more efficient than earlier photosynthetic processes. Cyanobacteria were so successful that they notably increased the level of oxygen in the atmosphere. Now, oxygen loves other elements and molecules. It's all about flirting with those valence electrons. When the electrons of other elements are gobbled up by oxygen, we say that the other element or molecule has been oxidized. Kind of sounds like an insult, Carl. To clarify, oxygen is not necessary for oxidation. The two words sound like they're necessarily related, but oxidation simply refers to the process of atoms losing their electrons. Oxygen just happens to be very good at causing oxidation. It's why an apple turns brown after you bite into it, removing its skin, which protects it from oxygen. It's also why iron rusts. The point is that oxygen is a frisky swinger and loves to bond with other elements. So, rather than just float about, a lot of the oxygen that was formed by cyanobacteria bonded with carbon in the atmosphere to make carbon dioxide, or other molecules. Or it oxidized elements in the earth, such as iron. In fact, one piece of evidence for the increase of oxygen because of cyanobacteria is the oxidation of iron. In easier words, the redness of it, in layers of sedimentary rocks. Eventually, about 2.4 billion years ago, geological evidence shows that oxygen became so abundant that free oxygen became available. This means that there was oxygen in the atmosphere that wasn't bonding with other elements. It was just chilling there. Several important things resulted from this, which is sometimes referred to as the Great Oxygenation Event. First, the anaerobic organisms, most of life, for whom oxygen was toxic, had a hard time of it. They either died or had to retreat to safe anaerobic environments. Although this time is not listed as one of the big 5 extinction events, It's notable that the event also goes by other names, including the oxygen catastrophe, the oxygen crisis, and the oxygen holocaust. None of those sound fun, Carl. Second, the oxygen in the atmosphere combined into O3 to create the ozone layer, which helped protect the surface of the Earth from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. This allowed life forms such as algae to venture more readily onto the land. Third, the increase in oxygen seemed to contribute to an ice age. The first snowball Earth, as it's sometimes called. Cyanobacteria were gobbling up carbon dioxide and producing oxygen, and the oxygen was breaking down methane in the atmosphere. The reduction of carbon dioxide and methane, both of which are greenhouse gases, meant that the Earth couldn't retain the sun's heat as well. As it cooled, it covered with snow and ice. The snow and ice reflected sunlight away all the more, leading to, well, a snowball effect in the literal sense. Fourth, the shift in the atmosphere opened the door for life forms that relied heavily on oxygen for metabolic processes, through respiration. This opened the door for eukaryotic cells, which we'll discuss in a moment, which in turn opened the door for multicellular creatures such as us. Kartik Iyer summarizes these points well. The release of oxygen by cyanobacteria was thus responsible for changes in the Earth's atmospheric composition, the rise of aerobic metabolism, and, ultimately, the revolution of multicellularity. Oxygen is the primary molecule that makes Earth what it is today, far more hospitable and beautiful than the early Earth. It is certainly no exaggeration to say that we owe our existence in present form to cyanobacteria. The Earth recovered from its ice age, it seems, in part, because cyanobacteria slowed down their photosynthetic processes when the oceans froze. More ice, think glaciers, means less accessible sunlight, which means less photosynthesis, which means less oxygen. Eventually, volcanic vents in the ocean that were releasing greenhouse gases broke through the ice, increasing those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and thus warming the planet. Perhaps around 1.8 billion years ago, a third major evolutionary pathway appeared: eukaryotes. It's unclear exactly how this happened. It may be that bacteria and archaea combined together like Power Rangers to form eukaryotes. That's at least one theory, and there's certainly evidence that eukaryotic cells contain prokaryotic ancestors. Eukaryotes are different from both archaea and bacteria, in that they have a well-defined nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. These compartmentalized organelles can engage in specialized actions, which allows for more complex development in eukaryote cells. Among the most important of these organelles is the nucleus, which keeps the genetic material of eukaryotes, DNA, separate and protected. In prokaryote, DNA just floats about. It can be passed on through reproduction, but it can also drift sideways, mixing with other prokaryotes as it does. In other words, it's a much less protected secret. But eukaryotes keep their genetic material locked up tight until it's time to reproduce. An interesting point about the organelles of eukaryotes is that, in at least 2 cases, the organelles didn't develop within the eukaryotes themselves. They resulted either from a eukaryote cell absorbing a bacteria or 2 prokaryote cells merging. Mitochondria, which is responsible for cellular respiration in eukaryote cells, that means it powers the cells, has its own unique DNA. That means it has different DNA than the DNA in the nucleus of the cell. This suggests that mitochondria were originally a different organism, and the DNA suggests it was a bacteria. The same is true of chloroplasts in plants and algae. In both cases, the host organism and the bacteria benefited from the arrangement, that is, from the absorption or the merging. Biologists refer to this as an endosymbiotic relationship. It's an extreme form of symbiosis where 2 entities kind of merge. But it's really fascinating if you think about it. The DNA in your mitochondria isn't human DNA. It's a variation of bacterial DNA, and you couldn't live without it. The split between prokaryotes, which include both archaea and bacteria, and eukaryotes, is important to the story of life because biologists suspect that the unique features of eukaryote cells, particularly their complex compartmentalized structure, are what enabled them to develop, eventually, into complex multicellular organisms. This took a long time, mind you. It's worth noting that if life began on Earth somewhere between 3.8 and 4.2 billion years ago, the current evidence suggests that for over 2 billion of those years, all of life, including eukaryotes, were single-celled organisms. Multicellular organisms don't seem to appear until around 1.5 billion years ago, though again perhaps a little earlier. And metazoans, multicellular animal organisms, only appear around 600 to 850 million years ago. A lot of life happens before anything even remotely resembling something you would call an animal appears. It might be helpful at this point to look at one way of classifying life on Earth. There have been many ways of doing so, and it would be wrong to say that taxonomies of life aren't controversial. But modern taxonomies tend toward a three-domain system in which all of life, at its most basic cellular level, is divided into three domains: bacteria, archaea, and Eukarya. You'll note that, according to this classification system, 2/3 of the domains of all life are reserved for single-celled organisms. Every fungus, plant, and animal that you see is part of the Ukaria domain. Animals, of which human beings are a part, are one of the 4 kingdoms of the Ukaria domain. We can further clarify this by looking at the different levels of the Linnaean taxonomy system, named after the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus. Yet another Carl who's better than you. My bingo card is almost filled out. These other levels come after domain and kingdom. In order, they are phylum, class, order, family, and genus. So, according to this system, modern humans are in the domain Eukarya, the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordate, because we're vertebrates, the class Mammalia, because we're chordates with hair and milk glands, the order Primate, because we're mammals with collarbones and grasping fingers, the family Hominids, because we're primates with flattish faces and three-dimensional vision, the genus Homo, because we're hominids who walk upright and have large brains, and the species Sapiens, because we're members of the Homo genus with high foreheads. Yes, Carl, some higher than others. And thin skull bones. Prokaryotes, both as archaea and bacteria, still exist today. But prokaryotes are still single-celled organisms, although they can take multicellular forms by working together as a group or colony. But it's worth noting, at the close of this video, that you and I remain dependent on prokaryotes in a way that they're not really dependent upon us. Prokaryotes, like cyanobacteria, still produce a great deal of oxygen for the atmosphere. If all humans died, cyanobacteria would probably be okay. Prokaryotes recycle essential elements such as carbon and nitrogen back into the environment. We need that. But again, without us, they'd be okay. But perhaps more profoundly, human beings are a composite of eukaryote and prokaryote cells. I've already noted that your cells have non-human DNA that isn't your DNA in them, in mitochondria. But it's also true that there are as many or more bacterial cells living in or on your body as there are human cells. They help you digest food, for instance, among a lot of other things. Without these bacteria, human bodies couldn't function. So we're in the domain Eukarya, but we are essentially composed of both eukaryote cells and prokaryote cells. And we couldn't survive otherwise. But prokaryote cells could. It's just an interesting way of highlighting the level of interconnectedness that human beings have with the world around us, including the community of life. We remain irrevocably dependent upon single-celled organisms such as bacteria. I hope you found this video enjoyable. Until next time, farewell.